Hello everyone, I'm Marquand. As the summer of 1998 wound down, there was concern that prolonged hot, dry weather could produce a significant forest fire season in Montana. As things turned out, the danger passed relatively quickly, but late August did become a smoky period in parts of the state. Of course, the 1998 fire season was nothing like what Montanans had seen 10 years before in 1988. That year brought a blazing hot spring and summer, and some of the largest and most destructive wildfires in decades. Fires near Helena, in the Bob Marshall Wilderness Complex, in Glacier National Park, and in the northwest corner of Montana. 1988, of course, also brought the fires of Yellowstone National Park, which burned more than 1 million acres of land there. The stories included in this half hour are not about Yellowstone. Instead, they are about fires which burned within the state of Montana and which were important in their own right. Like Yellowstone, the areas we'll visit in these stories have shown remarkable natural recovery from the fires of 10 years ago. They provide lessons about the role of fire in Montana's forest ecosystems and the role of humans in those same ecosystems. We begin with a fire that began inside a wilderness area but eventually grew to be a monster that swept over public and private property far from its place of origin. Its name was Canyon Creek. For 10 years, Bill Cunningham has led continuing education students up the North Fork of the Blackfoot River into the Scapegoat Wilderness. And for 10 years, he's told the story of seeing the Canyon Creek wildfires start with a bolt of lightning.
I was on a backcountry trip with Missoula-based outfitter Smoke Elser. There were 12 of us in the party, and this was late June, like I say, June 25th, and the entire month of June had been dry. It was just like a tinderbox back here. I remember riding along the trail, going up the North Fork, just right through this country where we are right now, and billows of dust were coming up from the horses. We then moved our camp up to the mouth of Canyon Creek, which is about 4 miles up this drainage from where we are right now. We set up camp and had dinner and put up the cooking fly, and that evening, not too long before dark, all of a sudden the sky turned dark and you could feel the mounting tension of an impending storm. You could literally feel the electricity in the air. And all of a sudden we began to see sheet lightning off in the distance and a few scattered rain showers, and the wind was picking up, and by gosh, we knew that, hooray, we're finally going to get a weather change. We're finally going to get away from this incredibly dry June that we had been experiencing up to this point. And so 3 of us, including Smoke and myself, were under the cooking fly, watching the dramatic beginning of what we knew would be a major lightning storm. And we were right next to a deep, dark, black body of water right below a cliff nearby that the local outfitters call the Devil's Bathtub. And I suppose because it's almost a satanic, black, sort of mysterious pool of water that it was given that name. And so here we are, close to the Devil's Bathtub at the mouth of Canyon Creek, little ridge off above us, and all of a sudden, a vertical bolt of lightning emanated from the sky straight down, hit a big old Douglas fir snag, and it erupted into a ball of fire. It was really dramatic, and we looked at this hardly believing our eyes. And then at that point, flames came up a little bit, we saw some smoke, and then it began to just downpour. A drenching, heavy, hard-hitting rain that just pounded the ground. And we thought, well, that's going to be a short-lived fire. That ain't going to go nowhere. So I scampered up there. It was, as I mentioned, right before dark. Got up on the ridge, looked it over. It looked like about a quarter of an acre was burning. It was well confined in a notch on 3 sides by rock. And just over this ridge from where we were camped, only about a quarter mile from our camp. So I was a little concerned that the fire might possibly spread and move toward our camp, even though it was raining really hard at that time. Next morning, we could hardly believe our eyes. We looked up on the ridge, and there it was, the smoke curling right up there, even though the rain had just lifted.
For more than 2 months, the Canyon Creek fire was allowed to burn within the Scapegoat and within its fire prescription. But in early September, a freak wind event turned it into a firestorm, which would blacken 250,000 acres of public and private land. 2 weeks after rain and snow extinguished the Canyon Creek blaze, Cunningham returned to this country and found life already beginning again.
Here and there we saw little green sprouts coming up. We saw some aspen sprouts, clone sprouts beginning to just sort of poke up through the otherwise burned out soil.
Retired school teacher Al Lubeck of Butte was with Cunningham on that trip. Lubeck has been coming into the North Fork for more than 40 years. And although the scale of the Canyon Creek fire bothered him in 1988, he believed it could do this country good. And now, 10 years after the blaze, he sees the good that has been done.
And so I was real wary, though. I thought the fire had burned just too much country. You know, I thought it should have burned some and then waited for other years. And anyway, what I've seen, it's been a really wonderful experience to me. I think the fire has enriched this country. That's my observation after 10 years. Every year I've come back every single year, and I can compare the country to what it was before the fire, and every year is a new experience. The country looks a little bit different. You have the succession of plants. What you have is just a wonderfully rich, lush countryside, an environment that you know, I see diversity here. You see diversity of plants, where what you had before was just sort of a monoculture of lodgepole pine, and you had little openings. But what's nice now is you can see, you know, the grasses and the forbs, and you know, a diversity of plants. But more than that, I see more elk in one trip than I saw in the previous 10 years prior to the fire. You know, it's you know, we've provided a lot of food for animals like elk. I never saw a grizzly bear in this country until last year, and I saw 3 of them.
Today, the burn area is blanketed with understory plants, including new trees. Meanwhile, the bleached trunks of the dead have begun falling, beginning their slow breakdown into the soil. And for Cunningham and Lubeck, it's a fascinating chapter in a long story.
It's just a lot of life that's here, and a diversity of life that didn't exist prior to the fire. The fire has been good for this country.
When it began in late June of 1988, the Canyon Creek fire was viewed as a purely natural and beneficial event within the Scapegoat Wilderness. But the longer the hot summer went on, the more worrisome the fire became. In late August, it crossed the Continental Divide, then crossed the wilderness boundary, expanding to some 60,000 acres. For the last 10 years, Bill Cunningham has led continuing education students along the fire's path and told them about the events of September 6th and 7th, when Canyon Creek became a nightmare.
The jet stream swooped right through this country and caused a tornado-like winds, 50 to 100 mile an hour winds in places. The fire spread an additional 180,000 acres within the short span of only 6 hours.
The fire burned within 9 miles of Augusta, consuming hayfields and ranch outbuildings, killing cattle, injuring firefighters, and forcing 125 people to be evacuated. Within days, hundreds of soldiers from Fort Lewis, Washington had arrived to fight the blaze.
We went through a comprehensive day led by them, by the crew bosses, where they linked up with each of their people and went through our people and went through the actual training, went through the protective shelters, showed them some video films, some real hands-on training for a full day.
Ironically, just before the soldiers arrived, snow and rain came to the Augusta area, forcing the evacuation of some high country firefighters. By September 17th, the fire had been doused, the soldiers were ready to depart, and the price tag of suppression had reached some $7 million after one of the most dramatic 10-day periods in Montana firefighting history. In 1988, Ray Krone of Augusta watched 20,000 acres of his ranch burn as the Canyon Creek fire roared out of the Scapegoat Wilderness and through the Rocky Mountain front.
And it's a terrible thing to see. The night the fire broke out and I finally found out about it, I came up here, tried to get the cattle out of here. We had in this whole area here 1,000 cows and calves right in the path of this fire. That morning when I went up here, this is dry gulch, this gulch up here. There was 8 pair of cows and calves up there that morning. When I went back about 5 that evening, after I'd heard about the fire and seen the fire guys all leaving, I couldn't get up there. That was all on fire in there. There was 8 cattle gone there. I knew that. With the man that was with me, the hired man, we tooted the horn and hollered and screamed and got all the cattle that was in this area to run down the country. On that ridge there, when we were coming down, the fire was rolling like a big ball, and they nearly outrun the pickup going down. It was just by the grace of God that I didn't lose all my cattle.
Just this summer, the Bowl Mountain Fire spilled out of the Bob Marshall Wilderness and onto the Lewis and Clark National Forest. In both instances, the fires followed heavily timbered passageways leading eastward from wilderness onto other lands. To prevent that from happening again, Lewis and Clark forest managers want to break up those passageways by setting fires inside the wilderness boundaries.
We're proposing to introduce fire into a portion of the upper South Fork of the Sun drainage to reduce the fuel loadings in an area of the wilderness boundary that we feel is vulnerable or weak, that fire could escape there easily, whether it be a prescribed natural fire or an unwanted wildfire. So we're proposing to introduce fire into that area to reduce the fuel loadings along that boundary so that we can allow wilderness fires to take their more natural role within the wilderness area there.
The forest has chosen the Scapegoat for its first wilderness fire project. McBratney says the idea is to burn west-facing slopes to create breaks in forest fuels. Those breaks would then slow down a fire and keep it inside wilderness boundaries. But ranchers like Ray Krone have their doubts, based on their 1988 experience.
I have no confidence in their ability to control a fire.
McBratney counters that the Forest Service will suppress any fire that threatens to burn too far, and no fire will be set unless weather conditions are right.
So it's going to have to be a moderately dry year. It's going to have a wetting or a moisture event coming closely there behind it before we can go in and light that area and expect to hold it.
McBratney says the proposed fire project won't happen until next fall at the earliest, after the forest completes its public review process.